There is something almost mathematical about the way certain people construct their own undoing. You don't see it while it's happening. You only see it after, when the pieces are all on the table and the sequence becomes obvious, and you realize that every single decision the man made to protect himself was, in fact, a decision to hand someone else exactly what they needed. That is the story you're about to hear. A man received a warning. He took it seriously. He spent money and time and considerable organizational energy making sure the warning couldn't come true. And then it did. Exactly as promised, on the schedule that had been set for him before he ever picked up the phone to call his security firm. The painting was called November Light. Oils on linen, roughly 24 by 30 inches, dated 1923. Attributed to a minor American regionalist whose reputation had been quietly revised upward over the previous decade by a series of auction results that anyone paying attention would have found worth examining. The frame was original. The provenance was documented, or had been documented, which is a different thing. It had hung in the same room of Reginald Ashford's Hamptons estate for 11 years, on the east wall of what he called the study. And his guests called the room with the painting in it, because the painting was the room's entire reason for existing. Everything else in there, the leather chairs, the single malt collection, the framed letters from people whose names were worth dropping, was furniture. The painting was the point. Ashford had paid $430,000 for it at a private sale in 2013. The seller had been a widow in her late 70s whose late husband had purchased the piece in 1981 for $11,000 and whose estate attorney had retained Ashford's firm, Ashford and Langley Insurance and Appraisal Services, LLC, headquartered in Midtown Manhattan, to assess the collection's value before the sale. The assessment came back at $380,000 for the full collection. Ashford bought the regionalist separately, privately, 6 weeks after the assessment closed, through a shell entity that appeared nowhere in the appraisal paperwork. The widow's attorney, a man named Gerald Patterson, who had practiced estate law in Nassau County for 30 years without distinguishing himself in any particular direction, signed off on everything and sent her a check for $430,000, which she considered a windfall and which Ashford considered a discount, because by the time the deal closed, he already had a buyer lined up at $700,000 who had been waiting for the piece to come available for 3 years. He didn't take that deal. He kept the painting instead. That detail matters. People who knew Ashford, and not many did because he worked hard to keep the circle shallow, would have said that he kept the painting because he loved it, and they would have been partly right. But the more operative reason was that the painting had become, in the years since the purchase, something that couldn't be cleanly sold without a conversation he didn't want to have. The market for that particular artist had moved. There had been an academic paper. There had been a retrospective at a regional museum in Ohio that drew more attention than anyone expected. The painting's value had been re-examined by people who examined such things professionally, and the number that came back, not officially, not in any document he was obligated to file, but in the private conversations that circulate through the collector world the way interest rates circulate through a bank, was somewhere between $1.2 and $1.4 million, which meant that selling it would require explaining to anyone who asked how a piece appraised at a fraction of that figure had ended up in his private collection through a transaction that postdated his own firm's assessment by 6 weeks. Ashford was a careful man. Careful men don't have those conversations. So the painting stayed on the wall, and Ashford told people he kept it because he loved it, which was true enough that he'd stopped noticing the other part. If you've ever watched someone talk about something they own with the particular tone that means they're actually talking about something they got away with, you know exactly how Ashford sounded when he talked about November Light. The note arrived on a Thursday in the second week of September. It came in a plain envelope, no return address, postmarked from a mailing center in Midtown. Ashford's housekeeper, a woman named Brenda who had worked for him for 9 years and who had her own opinions about the painting that she kept entirely to herself, brought it in with the rest of the mail and left it on his desk. He opened it after lunch. The note inside was written by hand in a clean, unhurried script on plain white cardstock. It read, "The painting on the east wall of your study will be gone before the first frost. I wanted you to know in advance. No signature, no demands, no explanation." Ashford read it twice. Then he set it down, finished his coffee, and called the security firm he'd used for the estate for the past 7 years, a company called Hargrove Protective Services, run by a former NYPD lieutenant named Don Hargrove, who had built a solid regional business in exactly this kind of residential security work. Ashford told Hargrove about the note. Hargrove asked if he wanted to involve the police. Ashford said no. Hargrove asked why not. Ashford said he'd rather solve the problem than document it. That answer told you everything about Reginald Ashford. He didn't want a police report. He wanted a wall. If this kind of confidence, or this kind of blindness, depending on how you look at it, resonates with you, you're in the right place. This channel is about what happens when the people who have always played by their own private rules encounter someone who has studied those rules longer than they've been making them. If that's a story you want to follow, stay with this one. And if you've never subscribed, do it now, before the story moves, because it's about to move fast. Hargrove took the assignment seriously. That was his professional nature, and also in this case, his professional liability. Because a man in his business who receives a warning about a specific target and fails to prevent the outcome doesn't work in that business much longer. He brought in 2 additional guards to supplement the 2 already on the property, establishing 4-person rotating coverage in 12-hour shifts. He installed motion sensor units on the 3 approaches to the main house that didn't already have them: the service road from the east, the beach access path from the south, and the gap in the hedgerow on the north perimeter that the landscaping crew used as an informal entrance when they came on Wednesdays. He moved the painting from the study to what he called the hardened room, an interior space on the 2nd floor that Ashford used as a secondary office, which had no exterior windows, a single door with a keycard lock wired to the main security panel, and a camera mounted at the threshold that fed to both the guard station and Hargrove's monitoring service in Riverhead. And then, because Hargrove was thorough, and because his contract required it for any engagement above a certain dollar threshold, he commissioned a full third-party security audit of the property. The firm he used for audits was a company called Caldwell Technical Assessments, based out of Garden City, which did this kind of work for insurance companies, private estates, and a handful of municipal clients who needed independent verification of their physical security posture. Caldwell sent a 2-person team: a senior assessor named Mitchell, who had done similar work for 15 years and who was licensed, vetted, and entirely legitimate, and an assistant who had been with the firm for 3 weeks, who carried equipment, took measurements, photographed sensor placements, logged keycard access points, and documented everything in the assessment report that would ultimately be delivered to Hargrove and to Ashford's insurance carrier. The assistant's name, on his Caldwell Technical Assessments employee badge, was David Reyes. Mitchell, who ran the assessment and wrote the final report, and had no reason to scrutinize a junior employee he'd been told was brought on to handle the documentation load during a busy fall season, never spent much time watching what Reyes was looking at. That was the nature of the work. The senior person assessed. The assistant documented. The system trusted itself. The audit took 2 full days. The report that Mitchell filed was thorough, 42 pages, detailed floor plan annotations, sensor coverage maps, keycard system schematic, threshold camera angles, shift overlap analysis. A document that described, in precise professional language, exactly how Reginald Ashford's estate was defended. Ashford received a copy. Hargrove received a copy. The insurance carrier received a copy. There was a 4th copy. Ask yourself, seriously, not rhetorically, but actually, if you were building a wall around something valuable, and someone offered to hand you the complete architectural plans for every wall you'd ever built, would you recognize what you were handing over? Or would you be too focused on the wall? Ashford was focused on the wall. October moved through the East End in its particular way. The light going low and golden in the afternoons, the summer people gone, the roads quieting down to the rhythms of the people who actually live there year-round. The estate sat at the end of a private lane off McCox Road, 3 acres of maintained grounds with a view of the bay from the south side of the house. In the second week of October, on a Tuesday, Brenda arrived at 7 in the morning as always, and noted that the 2 guards on the overnight shift were finishing their rounds. One of them, a man named Ray, who had been with Hargrove's firm for 4 years, told her it had been a quiet night. She made coffee and brought it to the guard station as she did every morning when she arrived before the day shift, and Ray thanked her the way he always did, and neither of them had any reason to think Tuesday, October 14th was any different from any other Tuesday. It wasn't quiet, though. It had been exactly the opposite of quiet, in the way that a chess game is exactly the opposite of quiet even when no one in the room is making a sound. The hardened room had a single point of entry. Hargrove had been correct about that. What the audit report had also noted, in a line on page 27 under the subheading Access Control Observations, was that the key card system governing that door ran on a firmware version that had a known synchronization lag when 2 access events were logged within a 12-second window. The manufacturer had issued a patch. The patch had not been installed. Mitchell had flagged it as a medium priority remediation item. Hargrove had logged it for follow-up. The follow-up was scheduled for the last week of October. The first frost came on the morning of October 15th. Brenda found it at 8:47. She'd gone upstairs to bring Ashford his second cup of coffee, knocked on the door of the secondary office, and when he didn't answer, realized he was still in the main bedroom. She left the coffee on the table in the hallway and was heading back down when something stopped her. The door to the hardened room was closed. It looked exactly as it always looked. She stood in the hallway for a moment she couldn't fully explain and then went back and checked the door, and it opened, because the keycard system had reset to default following the synchronization event the previous night. And she pushed it open and looked inside, and the room was undisturbed in every visible way, except that the east wall, where the painting had been rehung after the move, held nothing but the frame. The frame was original. It was still there. It was level. Behind it, tucked against the backing, was the note. The same note. The same handwriting. The same plain cardstock, unfolded, as if it had been placed there with care, as if whoever left it wanted to make sure it was legible and not creased. I wanted you to know in advance. Ashford stood in that room for a long time. Hargrove was called. Hargrove came. The footage from the threshold camera showed the hallway outside the hardened room for the full overnight period, and the footage was continuous, and nothing on it explained what had happened inside. The motion sensors on all 3 exterior approaches had logged no events between 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. The shift logs showed both guards completing their rounds on schedule. The keycard access log showed 1 entry, Ashford himself, at 9 p.m. the previous evening, when he'd gone in to look at the painting before going to bed, the way he sometimes did, the way a man does when he's proud of something he isn't sure he deserves. The log showed the door opening at 9 p.m. It did not show it opening again. Hargrove spent 3 days reviewing the footage and the logs and the audit report, and on the 4th day, he called Ashford and said there was a firmware issue in the keycard system that created a documented window under specific conditions, and that this window had been identified in the audit, and that he would be filing a full incident report with the insurance carrier. Ashford said he understood. What he didn't say, what he understood and didn't say, was that involving the insurance carrier meant a formal assessment of the painting's provenance. A claim on a piece valued at the number the carrier had on file, which was the number from his own firm's appraisal in 2013, adjusted for market appreciation to somewhere around $500,000, would require documentation. Documentation meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant the conversation he had spent 11 years not having. He didn't file the claim. There is a particular quality to the silence of a man who has just understood that the thing protecting him and the thing that can destroy him are the same thing. Ashford knew that silence. He sat with it. In the days that followed, he made no public statement. There was nothing to make a statement about. Officially, nothing had been reported. He told Hargrove to close the incident internally. He told Brenda with a steadiness that she recognized as the kind people use when they're holding something very still, that the painting had been sent for restoration and would be back in a few months. Brenda said of course and did not ask any follow-up questions, which was one of the things Ashford had always valued about her, and which was also, as it turned out, one of the things she valued about herself. What Brenda had not told Ashford, had not told anyone, was that she had met David Reyes on the 2nd day of the security audit when she brought coffee to the assessment team working in the main hallway, and that he had thanked her with a particular warmth that she recognized as genuine rather than transactional, and that over those 2 days, she had told him, in the small conversational way that happens between people doing adjacent work in the same house, that she had been thinking about leaving. Not for any single reason. The accumulation. 9 years of watching a man treat everything around him, including the people, as assets to be managed rather than people to be known. She had not said it that bluntly, but she had said enough. 3 weeks after the painting disappeared, she received a letter at her home address. Inside was a check drawn on an account she didn't recognize for an amount that was equivalent to 11 months of her salary. There was a note with it. Not cardstock this time, plain paper, typed. It said, "For the years, and because you made the coffee for everyone." She cried, which surprised her. Then she called her sister in Albuquerque, who had been asking her to come out for 2 years. Then she gave Ashford her notice. He accepted it with the brisk efficiency of a man processing a logistical update, and she thought, walking out of that house for the last time on a gray November morning with the bay visible through the south-facing windows and the empty frame still on the wall of the hardened room where nobody had bothered to remove it, that she was glad the painting was gone. Not for any complicated reason, just because it had sat in that room for 11 years at the center of something that hadn't been right. And now it was somewhere else, and she was going somewhere else, and the room could hold whatever it wanted. The painting itself, where it went, what it became, whether it was sold or stored or returned to the estate of the woman whose husband bought it in 1981 for $11,000 and whose family had received in the week after the disappearance an anonymous certified payment that covered the difference between what the widow had been paid in 2013 and what the piece had been worth at the time of the assessment. Those are details the story doesn't hand you. That's deliberate. Some things are more interesting as questions than as answers. What can be said is this. The gentleman was not in the Hamptons when Brenda found the empty frame. He was on the west side of Manhattan in a diner on 9th Avenue, where he sometimes went on weekday mornings because the coffee was bad and the booths were private, and nobody who ate there was the kind of person who paid attention to anyone else's business. He read the news on his phone. He drank the coffee. He left a tip that the waitress, whose name was Carol and who had worked that shift for 12 years and who was putting her youngest through community college on the income, would later describe to her co-worker as the best Tuesday she'd had in a while. He didn't stay to see the aftermath. He never did. The aftermath was Ashford's to live in, and Ashford was going to be living in it for a long time. Not because the painting was gone, but because of the particular shape of the silence it left behind. The kind of silence that asks questions. The kind that comes when a man who has spent years being careful realizes that careful and clean are not the same word. The note was the calling card, not the empty frame, not the firmware exploit, not the audit report turned against itself. The note, placed back behind the frame with the same unhurried care with which it had originally been written, was the message. It said, "I told you. You didn't believe it was possible." And so it was. There are people in this world who have built their security on the assumption that other people can be managed, that anyone who presents a threat will announce it in a form that's easy to dismiss, and that dismissal itself is a form of control. Reginald Ashford had operated on that assumption for a long time, in rooms a lot more consequential than the study of a Hamptons estate. The note wasn't a mistake on his part. It was a read. He read the note, and he read it correctly, as a provocation. And then he did exactly what the provocation was designed to make him do, which was build the wall that was the door. That's not stupidity. It's something more interesting than stupidity. It's the specific blindness that comes from having always been the smartest person managing the situation. When you've won every negotiation by controlling the information, it doesn't occur to you that someone might be feeding you exactly the information they need you to have. You stayed until the end of this one. That means something. Not every story earns that kind of attention, and this channel doesn't take it for granted. If this episode landed for you, if there was a moment where the pieces clicked and you felt the particular satisfaction of watching a wall become a door, hit the like button. It's the simplest signal you can send that this kind of storytelling is worth continuing, and it matters more than most people realize in terms of what gets made next. Subscribe if you haven't. This channel doesn't do volume, it does precision. Every story on here is built the same way this one was, from the inside out, with every piece placed before you can see why it matters. If that's the kind of storytelling you want more of, the subscription is how you make sure you're there when the next one drops. And before you go, the question worth sitting with. Have you ever been so focused on defending against the threat you could see that you handed someone else exactly what they needed to walk through the door you thought you'd locked? What did it take for you to realize what had happened? Some walls are built for the person building them. The lock isn't always on the side you think it's on.